Tonight, we return together to Athens, where moonlight still touches white marble columns and the Aegean Sea breathes with the rhythm of philosophy. More than 2,400 years ago, a young man stood in that city, a place where wisdom and chaos lived side by side. His name was Plato. And tonight, we will listen to his journey, the journey of a man who looked upon the world and asked, among all that we see, what is truly real? Athens, in the 5th century BCE, was the beating heart of Greek civilization. Here, everything was decided by words, a promise, an oath, an accusation, and sometimes a single word could end a life. The city was brilliant, yet fragile. After its long war with Sparta, Athens had lost its glory. Democracy wavered. Those in power spoke of justice, but used justice to destroy anyone who dared to question it. In a quiet corner of the city, a young Plato watched that world in silence. He was born around 428 BCE into an old aristocratic family, a family that had stood on both sides of Athens' endless debate, some friends of tyrants, others defenders of democracy. That division shaped his youth, filling it with both privilege and uncertainty, authority and doubt. His father Ariston claimed descent from King Codrus, the last king of Athens, who sacrificed himself to save the city from invasion. His mother Perictione came from the lineage of Solon, the great lawgiver who drafted the first codes of Athenian democracy. Thus, in Plato's veins flowed two legacies at once, that of rulers and that of justice's architects. But as he came of age, Plato realized a bitter truth: those great names had become ghosts of history, and the city that bore their memory was now but a shadow of its ideals. From his veranda, he could see Athens glowing each dawn. Yet in that light, he sensed a weariness only those who see too deeply can feel. In his youth, Plato was taught poetry, music, athletics, and mathematics, the subjects the Greeks called paideia, the education of free citizens. He was praised as a gifted student, a lyrical poet, a lover of beauty, perhaps once dreaming of becoming a poet himself. It is said that in his youth he trained in wrestling, and from that sport took the nickname Platon, meaning broad-shouldered. But fate had other plans for him, plans that reached far beyond poetry or physical triumph. One day, Athens opened new spaces, public forums, where citizens could speak, where laws were debated, where free thinkers stood before the crowd and asked questions no one wished to hear. One morning in the bustling agora, Plato saw an old man standing barefoot among the people. His cloak faded, his voice calm and steady. The crowd mocked him, but he only asked, "You say you understand justice. Then tell me, what is justice?" That man was Socrates. And that simple question would change the course of Plato's life forever. Their conversations did not take place in formal halls, but in the narrow streets of Athens, beside the blacksmith's forge, before the barracks, among merchants, and even with poor children in the alleys. Socrates drew Plato away from the easy satisfaction of beauty and skill into another kind of inquiry, one not about what makes poetry or what makes art, but about what makes a soul, what makes truth. Socrates taught Plato that philosophy does not begin with answers, it begins with doubt. Indeed, he often posed a single weighty question. When we believe we know, that is when we are furthest from the truth. It may not be his literal words, but it captures the essence of his thought. Plato, barely 20 years old, stood amid the noise of the Athenian square, surrounded by footsteps and voices, and felt as though the world itself had paused. He watched the grown men speak of power, ambition, victory, yet within himself he heard another voice, the silence of the soul asking. He realized that beauty alone was not enough, strength was not enough, fame was not enough without the question, who am I? What do I know? What am I seeking from that realization? He planted the first flag of his philosophical journey, to learn not merely to understand, but to awaken his own soul. The beauty of poetry was no longer enough, for he had glimpsed another beauty, the beauty of truth. From that moment, all the splendor Athens promised him, politics power, prestige faded into insignificance. Plato had found his path, not the road that led to the assembly, but the one that led inward into the depths of the human mind. Yet Athens, the city of freedom, feared its own freedom. They accused Socrates of corrupting the youth and failing to honor the gods. In 399 BCE, Socrates was sentenced to death. Plato sat in the back row, silent, as his teacher lifted the cup of poison to his lips. The old man did not weep. He only said to his students, "The philosopher does not fear death, for death is merely the soul returning to where it belongs." That night, Plato left Athens. His heart was shattered, but within those ashes, a new question began to burn. If the world can kill the one who seeks truth, then where does truth truly reside? In the hands of men, or in a realm beyond their sight? After the death of Socrates, Athens became too narrow for Plato. The squares where philosophy once echoed now resounded only with arguments and accusations. So he left, carrying with him grief and a question still unanswered. How can the human soul touch the truth? Plato journeyed far, not merely across distance, but across ways of understanding the world. He crossed the Aegean Sea at a time when such a passage was not routine, but transformative, leaving behind the familiar intellectual rhythms of Athens and moving toward places where knowledge wore very different forms. In Cyrene, he encountered mathematicians who did not argue through rhetoric or persuasion, but through proportion, symmetry, and proof. Their language was not opinion, but number. They did not ask what felt convincing, but what remained true regardless of who spoke it. There, Plato learned something that would quietly reshape his entire philosophy, that the order of the universe does not bend to human desire or political power. It does not respond to emotion, tradition, or authority. It follows laws that are indifferent to the human world, laws that cannot be voted into existence or argued away. Geometry, in particular, revealed a reality that was invisible yet undeniable. A triangle obeyed its truths, whether anyone believed in them or not. A ratio held its balance, even in silence. To understand such things required not force, but discipline, an intellect trained to see beyond appearances and resist the temptations of immediacy. This encounter planted a crucial seed in Plato's thought. If mathematics could reveal a realm of truths untouched by time and opinion, then perhaps reality itself was layered. Perhaps what the senses delivered was only the outer skin of the world, while its true structure lay deeper, accessible only to a mind that had been purified of haste, bias, and appetite. Knowledge in this view was not something added from the outside. It was something uncovered, like a pattern emerging as noise fell away. From Cyrene, Plato traveled onward to Egypt, a land whose relationship with time itself felt fundamentally different. Greece argued, Egypt remembered. Where Greek temples debated ideas, Egyptian temples preserved continuity. Their walls were covered in hieroglyphs not meant to persuade, but to endure symbols designed to outlast generations, dynasties, even civilizations. In the quiet corridors of stone, Plato encountered a culture that treated knowledge as inheritance rather than invention. Within those temples, Plato encountered another lesson, subtler, but no less powerful. Egyptian religious thought suggested that the soul did not begin with the body, nor end with it. Life was a passage, not an origin. The soul entered the body as one enters a dwelling, stayed for a time, and then departed, carrying with it a burden of memory and judgment. Existence was not linear, but cyclical, and death was not annihilation, but transition. For Plato, this idea resonated deeply. It offered an explanation for something he already sensed, but could not yet articulate, that learning often feels like remembering. That certain truths strike the mind not as discoveries, but as recognition's moments when something long forgotten suddenly becomes clear again. If the soul carried within it traces of an eternal world, then education was not the creation of knowledge, but its recollection. To know was to remember what the soul had once seen before it became entangled in flesh. These journeys did not turn Plato into a collector of foreign beliefs. They refined his intuition that the visible world was not self-sufficient. Mathematics showed him a realm of perfect relations untouched by decay. Egypt showed him a vision of the soul unbound from a single lifetime. Together they shaped his conviction that reality was divided not into sacred and profane, but into surface and depth. The senses revealed movement and change. The intellect, properly trained, could glimpse permanence. When Plato eventually returned to Athens, he carried these lessons quietly within him. They would later emerge as the theory of forms, as the doctrine of the immortal soul, as the belief that philosophy was not merely argument, but preparation, a slow turning of the whole being toward what is real. His travels did not give him answers. They sharpened his sense of what questions were worth asking. And from those questions grew a philosophy that would never again allow the human mind to feel entirely at home in the world of appearances alone. When the desert wind brushed past his face, he understood true knowledge does not lie in what the eyes can see, but in what the soul can remember. Yet it was in the West and Sicily, where he tried to marry philosophy with politics, that Plato glimpsed the darker side of idealism. In the palace of Syracuse, among power and ambition, he tried to plant the seed of justice, but the soil there was too cold for it to grow. Kings did not wish to hear philosophers, and philosophers could not rule like kings. Still, when he left, he did not call it failure. For in every land he visited, Cyrene Egypt, Sicily, Plato saw the same truth, that all forms of knowledge, however different, point toward a single torch, the understanding of the soul. And in that flame he found Socrates again, found Athens again, and found the light within himself. At the northern edge of Athens stood a grove of ancient olive trees, where the wind through the leaves whispered like the voices of gods. There, around 387 BCE, Plato founded the Academy, the first institution of higher learning in human history. There were no marble gates, no throne for the teacher, only simple columns, wax tablets, and souls thirsting for understanding. The Greeks called it Akademeia, named after the hero Akademos, who had once dedicated the land to knowledge and loyalty. To Plato, the academy was not a school, but a refuge for the soul, a place where the mind could shed the dust of the world and remember what it had known before birth. He once said, "Learning is remembering." For Plato, knowledge was not something found outside, but a light asleep within the mind, needing only another torch to awaken it. At the academy, Plato did not lecture like a distant master. He conversed. He asked questions, and often he simply waited in silence. Sometimes a single discussion could last for hours, centered on just one question. What is justice? Or, what is the soul? In those silences, students realized that philosophy was not about quick answers. It was about learning to listen to hear one's own mind, echo back, to feel reason collide with intuition. People said the air in Plato's academy was thick with thought. His students came from across the Greek world, from city-states, from Sicily, from distant Ionia. Some were mathematicians like Eudoxus. Others were politicians, poets, dreamers. And among them was a young man with keen eyes and a mind like a blade, Aristotle. Aristotle arrived at the academy at 17. For 20 years he studied, debated, and became Plato's closest intellectual companion. Plato saw him as a spiritual son, a mind both admired and feared. For Aristotle was different. Where Plato sought eternal ideas, Aristotle wanted to understand the world as it was. Plato once smiled and said to another student, "Aristotle is a young horse kicking at its stall, but for that very reason it will run far." And he was right. When Plato died, Aristotle left Athens carrying the flame of the academy, and would later found his own Lyceum, the second great school where new thought rose from the ashes of the old. Thus, Plato's academy was more than a school. It was the root of all schools. There, a new world was born, the world of reasoning evidence, definition, and rational soul. The world we now call philosophy, from two Greek words, philo, love, and sophia, wisdom. They say that above the academy's gate, a stone inscription read, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here." But geometry for Plato was not just mathematics, it was a symbol of order and reason. He believed that only when the mind could measure and reason could it glimpse the invisible, the perfect forms of which the material world was but a shadow. Every session began with a question and ended in silence. He let his students find the path themselves, for he believed the teacher is merely a midwife of the mind. He compared himself to one who helps the soul give birth to knowledge, not by imparting it, but by helping it remember what it already knows. The soul before it came into the body, he wrote in Phaedrus, once beheld the true, the beautiful, and the good. What we call learning is only the remembering of that vision. For more than 2 centuries, Plato's academy endured generation after generation until Rome conquered Athens and the olive groves burned. But the flame of knowledge did not die. It lived on in philosophy, religion, and science. Every time someone asks why Plato stands behind that question, every time someone looks at the stars and believes in an eternal order beyond them, that is Plato whispering from his olive garden. And every time we sit quietly and ask ourselves, who am I and why am I here? The academy lives again, not in stone or column, but in the curiosity of the human soul. Plato's academy did not only give birth to philosophers, it gave birth to the way humanity thinks about truth. In our own age, where knowledge fits into screens and opinion often replaces understanding, the academy still reminds us. True knowledge is not what we know, but what changes us once we know it. Plato did not teach us to be clever. He taught us to be still, to hear the quiet voice within the voice he called the soul, remembering its first light. Human beings, he said, must leave the cave of illusion, the place where we see only the shadows of truth, and step into the sunlight. They will be dazzled, Plato wrote. They will be afraid, but only then will they see the real world. In his masterpiece, The Republic, Plato dreamed of an ideal city, a place where each person did what they were best at, where knowledge guided power and rulers were those who understood justice above all the philosopher kings. He wrote, "Until philosophers are kings, or those who are called kings truly become philosophers, there will be no end to the troubles of humankind." That was not mere political advice. It was a reminder only when wisdom and compassion sit upon the same throne will humanity find peace. Years later, as Athens changed, Plato still sat beneath the same olive trees, watching his students debate geometry, the soul, and the stars. He was no longer young, but his eyes still shone. Someone once asked him, "Master, what is the greatest thing you have learned in life?" He answered softly, "That knowledge is not possession, it is remembrance." Then he smiled a smile as gentle as wind through leaves, for he knew his students' souls would continue the journey. One of them was Aristotle, and through them the torch of wisdom would burn for millennia. Plato died around 347 BCE, within the very academy he had founded. They say he passed in his sleep while his students read him a poem. The window was open. Moonlight poured over the stone table, and a soft breeze carried the scent of ripe olives. Perhaps he smiled, for at last he had returned to the world of pure forms, where the soul is free from the body's weight. And now, as you close your eyes, think of Plato, the young man who searched for truth within the shadows. Perhaps, somewhere within you, a small philosopher is still asleep, a soul waiting to be awakened. For as Plato believed, we learn not to know more, but to remember what we once knew, that there exists a realm eternal and radiant, where justice, beauty, and truth never fade. And tonight, if a faint light flickers within you, that is Plato whispering, "Wake up, my friend. The soul remembers." Imagine this. You were born in darkness, deep underground, where there is no sun, only the sound of wind slipping through cracks in the stone, and a faint, flickering fire behind you. In that cave, people are chained. Since birth, they have never been allowed to turn their heads. They do not know what lies behind them, only the wall before their eyes, where shifting shadows dance and distant echoes fill the air. They give names to those shadows, man, horse, mountain, star. They believe that is the real world, for since the moment they were conscious, they have never seen anything else. Plato called that place the cave, not merely a location, but a symbol of the human mind before it learns to think. We, he said, are not so different from those prisoners. Inside the cave, everyone agrees with one another. When someone points to the shadow of a horse, the others also say, "horse." When someone sees a human-shaped shadow move, they say that person is walking. They laugh, they debate, they even hold contests to guess what the next shadow will be. And thus illusion hardens into a system. The people in darkness do not know there is a source of light behind them, that between them and the fire stand those who lift real objects, casting the shadows on the wall. For Plato, our world is much the same. We look at images, sensations, matter, opinions, and believe they are reality. But in truth, everything we see is only a copy. The shadows of eternal forms of the beautiful, the good and the true, things that cannot be seen with the eyes, but can only be recollected by the soul. Pause and consider, how many things do we believe are true, simply because many others believe them? Plato asked that question more than 2,000 years ago, and the answer still hangs today among the glow of our screens. One day, one of the prisoners is freed. His chains are removed. He stands, his legs trembling, for he has never walked in his life. The fire behind him dazzles his eyes. He turns and for the first time sees the flame, the source of the images he once took for reality. He is astonished, for if this light can create images, what then creates this light? A guide, someone who has known the light, pulls him out of the cave. The way is steep, rocky, dark. Each step hurts. The stronger the light, the more his eyes ache. He collapses, wants to turn back, to hide in the familiar dark. but the other says, "Be patient. Your eyes are not yet accustomed to the light of truth." At last, he emerges from the cave. The first light makes him weep, not from pain, but because for the first time he understands what truly seeing is. At first, he can only make out his own shadow on the ground, then the reflections of things in water. After that, he sees trees, people the sky, and finally, he can look straight at the sun. Plato says, "As the sun illumines all things, so we may see the good illumines the mind, so we may understand." Light is not merely physical, it is a metaphor for knowledge. When the soul is illumined by reason, it perceives true reality and is no longer deceived by sensation. In Plato's language, this is the awakening of the soul. The soul once knew these things before birth, but upon entering the material world, it forgot. Learning, therefore, is not the intake of something new. It is recollection and amnesis. Plato writes, education is not stuffing knowledge into a blind soul, but turning that soul back toward the light. Like the freed prisoner, we do not study to acquire novelty, but to remember what we once knew, what the soul has always sought, truth, beauty, and goodness. But then he decides to return to the cave to tell the others. Outside, there is a radiant world. There is light sky and truth. He walks in, his eyes now adapted to brightness cannot see well in the dark. Those inside laugh at him. "Are you blind? What light are you talking about?" When he describes the world outside, they call him mad, a traitor, and even threaten to kill him if he keeps speaking of that light. Plato knew this all too well. He had watched Socrates, who tried to awaken Athens, put to death for telling the truth. Those who remain in the cave, Plato writes, will kill anyone who tries to free them. The world, therefore, needs more than knowledge. It needs courage. The courage to endure the light, to step out of the shadows, and to return to help others, even at one's own peril. Plato maps this journey in 4 stages like rungs on a ladder of knowing eikasia. Imagination, the realm of images and reflections, the lowest level. Plato calls eikasia imagination. Here, the human soul still sleeps. In the cave, it is when we see shadows of shadows blurred, reflections, images, rumors, distorted memories. We trust what eyes and ears report, not knowing these are only images of images. Like looking at a portrait and thinking we understand the person, or hearing a story online and believing we know the whole truth. Plato says, at this level, the mind lives in the illusion of knowledge. We know a little and think we know all. In that darkness, the soul is like unopened eyes mistaking firelight for the sun. Eikasia is blind belief where images replace reality. Yet it is also where the journey begins, for only by realizing we are watching shadows can we long to seek the true source of light. Pistis belief and the world of the senses. The second rung is pistis belief. We have escaped images but remain bound to the sensory world. We trust that the things around us, trees, people, the moon, the sound of rain are real and unchanging. But in fact, they are still only the material shadows of higher forms, the eternal realities in the intelligible realm. We look at a rose and call it beautiful, yet the rose withers, changes, vanishes. So, what is beauty itself? Plato says everything in this world is a copy imitating a perfect form. At pistis, the soul begins to trust in order, but does not yet grasp its principle. Such a person may love science and observation, but has not yet asked, why is it so? He sees sky stars wind without realizing these are the language of a higher intelligence, the language of the good. Dianoia, reason, and the realm of thought. The third rung is dianoia reason, analytic thinking. Here we begin to use intellect to understand the world, to wield knowledge as an instrument rather than mere feeling. Mathematics, geometry, astronomy, music. These train the soul to reason. For Plato, mathematics mediates between matter and spirit, not dependent on the senses, yet still using symbols. A circle on paper is never perfect, but in the mind, we can conceive a perfect circle. Thus does the soul begin to touch the world of forms. At Dianoia, the soul is like the prisoner climbing upward. The eyes still ache from the light, but a new question has formed. What makes things be? This is the stage of scientific and logical knowledge, yet Plato warns reason, used only to analyze, is not enough to reach truth. It is like a lamp at night, illuminating a patch of darkness, but not yet bringing the dawn. Noesis pure intellection, where the soul meets the good. The highest rung is noesis pure intellection, the knowledge of a soul set free. Now the prisoner has stepped fully into the world above. His eyes behold the true sun. His soul joins the source of the universe's light, what Plato calls the form of the good, the origin of all understanding, and the reason anything can exist at all. Noesis is no longer thinking but spiritual insight, a seeing without eyes, an understanding without words. In that moment, the soul no longer asks why, because it becomes one with the very thing it sought. Plato writes in Republic 5:17b, "The one who has seen the sun no longer longs for the night, yet he adds that one will pity those who remain in darkness, for they do not yet know they sleep." This is where knowledge becomes compassion, and understanding becomes love. Love of truth, of beauty, and of souls not yet freed. The unity of the four. The soul's ascent, Plato does not offer these levels to rank people, but to trace the path any soul can take. From Icasia to Noesis is the human pilgrimage from the darkness of sensation to the light of spirit. A child is born into Icasia, believing whatever is told. An adult lives in pistis, trusting experience matter habit. A scholar dwells in Dianoia, able to analyze, prove reason. But only the truly awakened enter noesis, where the soul no longer seeks knowledge, but becomes it. They see the good in all things, the beauty in every being, and understand that knowledge does not separate us from the world, it reunites us with the whole. This is the deep meaning of Plato's philosophy. Knowledge is not power, it is light. If Plato lived today, he might look around and ask, where are human beings upon that ladder? Most of us remain in Icasia, believing images, what is propagated, trusting the glow of screens more than the sun. Some reach pistis, seeking evidence, science experience, yet staying with what can be seen, touched, measured. Fewer climb to Dianoia, where they begin to ask, why? And very few touch noesis, where they realize knowledge is not a treasure to possess, but a stream to enter. Plato's knowledge does not aim to be above others, but to be at one with the good. In that union, the soul is free, unfettered by fear, ambition, or the illusions of shadow. Plato says the one who understands the good needs no one to command him to do good. True knowledge is not a rule book. It is illumination from within. Like the one who has stepped out of the cave, they no longer fear the dark, for they know the light remains even if they turn away. Every soul in Plato's view is climbing one rung of that invisible ladder, and each time we doubt what we see, each time we choose thinking over blind belief, we take another step closer to the place where the soul can say, now I have seen the sun. Tonight, if you sense a small glimmer within an intuition that there is something deeper than passing images, do not extinguish it. Let your soul climb Plato's rungs. For as he says, light does not only shine outward, It awakens what sleeps within us. Most of us live upon the first two rungs, imagination and belief. Very few rise to reason, and almost none to pure intellection. Plato does not blame us. He only reminds us, do not sleep in the dark. In each person, a portion of light waits to be awakened, a seed of the soul. And the philosophical journey in the end is not academic, it is inner transformation. When we dare to question, we unfasten the chains. When we dare to ache in the light, we are reborn. When we dare to return to help others, we live the fullness of the soul. More than 2,000 years have passed, but the cave remains. Only now it bears another name, social media. We gaze into screens, see a multitude of images, stories, emotions, opinions, and imagine that is the world. But those images, like shadows on the wall, are curated versions of reality. We believe, argue, rage, love through phantom silhouettes, while the real light, real life, and real truth lie out there where real people breathe. If Plato lived today, he might say, the modern cave has Wi-Fi, and he would still smile, for there are still souls that seek the light. Light is not fame, nor an opinion widely applauded. It is the quiet of a mind that realizes I was blind, and now I see. Freedom is not merely the breaking of chains. When the prisoner steps out, he is no longer bound, but no longer sheltered. The familiar darkness vanishes, leaving a space. In the new light, he must ask, who am I now? What do I believe Plato understood, that freedom is not only escape from oppression, but responsibility to the light? Once the soul has seen the real, it no longer has the right to deceive itself. Hence Plato's hard saying, knowledge is pain before it is blessing, for to know is to lose the safety of ignorance, and in that loss to become whole. In the Republic, Socrates asks Glaucon if he might be killed upon returning, should he go back out at all, and he answers, yes, for nothing is nobler than the soul's vision of truth. Plato did not craft this allegory to tell a tale, but to draw a map of awakening. Each of us is a prisoner. Each day we dwell between shadow and light, and philosophy rightly understood is the soul's ascent from the cave, its beholding of the sun, and its return bringing a small flame into the darkness so that other souls may see one another. Night deepens. The wind on the roof still carries a distant echo of Athens. If anyone asks, what can Plato still teach our time? Say that he does not teach. He holds up a mirror. He shows us we are still seated among shadows, hands on the invisible chains of habit and illusion, and that we can even now stand up. Each time we doubt, refuse an easy answer, seek truth, though it may hurt our soul, climbs a little higher out of the cave, and the light, however faint, waits for us. For as Plato says, the light of the soul is stronger than any darkness in the world. Imagine this. In the midnight of Athens, as wind from the Aegean slips past oil lamps, a small circle gathers around a stone table and asks the question humanity has never fully answered. What is justice? Not in law books, but in the human soul itself. Plato recounts that dialogue in his greatest work, The Republic, a conversation between Socrates and his companions, held not in a court, not on a battlefield, but by lamplight, where philosophy and life touch. They speak of the person, the city power, and ethics, and at last they arrive at a dream, an ideal city where every soul stands in its right place, and justice is no longer a slogan, but the very breath of life. Plato and the perennial question, who should rule? Plato wrote The Republic after witnessing Athens' moral and political collapse. Athens' center of learning and democracy had become a place where people voted by feeling, not reason. Orators were praised for speaking well, not for speaking truly. And most of all, they condemned Socrates, Plato's teacher, to death, simply because he asked the questions no one wished to face. For Plato, the death of Socrates proved that democracy without knowledge can become the tyranny of the crowd. Democracy passes into despotism, he writes, Republic Book 8. Plato began to see that the majority can be wrong. Therefore, he sought another model, one in which understanding not vote tallies decides who should hold power. In Greek, philosophia means the love of wisdom. Not everyone with a degree or reputation is a philosopher in Plato's sense. He defines the philosopher by the nature of the soul, not by occupation. They love truth more than advantage. They are not bought by fame, money, or power. They know their limits. I know that I know nothing. Socrates' stance is their foundation. They view the world through reason, not raw emotion, seeing order and chaos law within change, and the good within apparent opposites. They live for the soul, not the body. For the soul to Plato is immortal and bears within it knowledge of the eternal forms, truth, goodness, beauty. The philosopher is the lover of the vision of truth. Republic 475 E.T. Eats. Thus, when Plato says only the philosopher is fit to rule, he is not endorsing a caste of scholars, but a kind of person, one who lives by reason, understands the good, and does not fear the truth. Politics without philosophy is for Plato a storm with no compass. Those who wield power without seeing the good will rule by instinct, ambition, fear, self-interest. In Republic 6, he writes, unless philosophers rule as kings, or those who are now called kings, and leading men genuinely and adequately philosophize, there can be no end to the troubles of states. 4.7.3 D to EICs. In other words, a society flourishes only when rulers know what is right, not merely what is popular. The deeper reason only philosophers grasp the form of the good, the light of the intelligible realm, just as the sun illuminates the visible world, just as the sun gives light to the visible world. The form of the good gives truth to the intelligible world. Republic 6.508 ed A. If a leader cannot see the light of the good, then however skillful he moves in darkness. Crucially, Plato is not cheerleading dictatorship. He does not insist that a single philosopher must rule. He insists that power must be joined to wisdom and virtue. The philosopher king symbolizes the union of knowledge and justice. Such a person does not seek to rule. Yet if the wise refuse, the blind will. The heaviest penalty for refusing to engage in politics is to be ruled by someone inferior to yourself. Republic 347 Dasariti. The true philosopher cannot live apart from the city. Light matters only when it shines back into the dark. So the genuine philosopher must return to the cave, accepting the risk of misunderstanding, even harm, to guide others. Today we have no philosopher kings. We have politicians, managers, technologists. Plato's question remains, do those in power truly understand what is right or merely do what pleases the crowd? Modern politics stands on votes, but the majority sways more easily by emotion than by reason. Democracy without education, Plato warns, is a road to disorder. Technology holds data, not justice. Algorithms can model behavior, but cannot know the good. Without ethics, intelligence, human or machine, can become a ruthless ruler. Education, the root of order. For Plato, only when people learn to love truth can a society escape the cycles of ignorance and ambition. We may not need a literal philosopher king, But we need a philosophical politics in which reason, science, and ethics speak to one another. Plato's saying looks deeper than the ruler. It points at us. Within each person lies a little commonwealth where reason, spirit, and appetite coexist. If reason leads, spirit upholds it, and appetite listens, we govern ourselves like a philosopher. If appetite rules, we become citizens enslaved by our own desires. This is Plato's point. Each of us is a ruler of our own soul. To conquer oneself is the first and noblest victory, laws. Until philosophers become kings, there will be no rest from evil. Though 2 millennia old, that bell still tolls in an age of data and noise. Plato does not bid us worship philosophers. He urges us to become lovers of truth, even if it leaves us alone in a crowd. True power is not on a throne, but in a mind that lights itself. Plato likens society to a ship. The people are sailors, each with opinions. The real captain is the one who understands storm stars and course perhaps not beloved, but able to bring the ship safe to shore. Without knowledge, he says our ship will only circle in the night. To understand justice, Plato begins with the soul. The soul is not one thing, but 3 parts, a structure, later echoed in Freud, Jung, and modern thought. Reason logistikon, the rational part, the highest part dwelling place of knowledge, clarity, and discernment. It is the charioteer looking ahead, weighing consequences, seeking the good, and truth, the soul's light. Spirit, thymoides, the spirited part, seat of honor, self-respect, courage, will. It is the soul's fire. When trained, it defends reason. When neglected, it hardens into anger, pride, violence. Thymos also means life-breath valor, the energy behind moral action. Appetite, epithemedikon, the appetitive part. All bodily urges: food, sleep, pleasure, possession. Not evil without it, we could not live. But if it rules, a person becomes a slave to pleasure and fear, forgetting he bears an immortal soul. Plato does not divide to condemn, but to show that all 3 are necessary and must be rightly ordered. A man is just when each part of his soul does its own work. Republic, 443. Datiti antiques. A just soul is a harmony in one direction. Reason leads, spirit protects and lends force. Appetite obeys and is attuned. Like music, reason conducts. Spirit is the brass and drums. Appetite is the ground beat, the breath. If all keep time, the soul resounds in harmony. If one rebels, discord. Plato calls inner imbalance a civil war within. The unjust man is at war with himself. Republic, 444. Itanti. This is not mere moral metaphor. It is perhaps the first diagnosis of inner conflict in philosophy. Long before Freud, Plato saw that humans are torn between reason and impulse, and that justice is not only social, but peace within. The city as the soul writ large. The polis mirrors the soul. If the soul has 3 parts, the city has 3 orders. Producers, farmers, artisans, merchants correspond to appetite. They generate wealth and meet needs. Guardians/warriors who protect and uphold honor and order correspond to spirit. Philosophers who devote their lives to knowledge correspond to reason. Each is necessary. Social justice, like personal justice, is not absolute equality, but harmony in difference. Justice means minding one's own business and not meddling with what belongs to others. Republic, 433. Jukti. Justice is not everyone doing everything. It is each doing the work proper to their nature and respecting the order of the whole. Society unravels when appetite, material interest dominates reason, or when spirit ambition for honor/power stops heeding justice. Plato saw this in Athens' rhetoric, money ambition replacing reason, the city's soul diseased. From the Phaedrus comes one of Plato's most beautiful images, the chariot with two horses. The charioteer is reason knowing the road to heaven where the good shines. The white horse is spirit noble, aspiring, courageous. The dark horse is appetite strong, stubborn, earthbound. If the charioteer is firm, the horses harmonize, and the chariot rises toward truth. If not, they pull apart, and the soul plunges into the ravine of instinct. Every soul bears wings, Plato suggests, but only when reason governs strength and passion do those wings rise toward the light of the good, the philosopher king. Plato's threefold city is not about status, but soul nature. When each order fulfills its work without trespass, the city becomes just. Justice is not a mirage, but a consonance between soul and world. In the dark of political chaos, Plato dreams of one figure, the philosopher king, not a scholar in an ivory tower, but one who has seen the true light, who has left the cave, understood the good, and then returned to lead. He writes until philosophers become kings, or those called kings truly become philosophers. Humanity will not know peace. Such a ruler does not crave power. He knows power tests the soul. He governs not by decree, but by knowledge of the human soul. He has seen the good, but he does not keep the light. He descends into the dark to teach others to see. He rules with self-mastery, fairness, and love of truth. Plato believed justice is not fantasy, but harmony of the inner and the outer. Justice does not come from outside. It begins when a person rules himself. When we listen to reason, when our spirit stands up for what is right, and our appetites are moderated by understanding we live with a just soul. And when there are enough such souls, the city or the world no longer dissolves into chaos, because each person has become the guardian of justice within. In the Republic, Plato devotes many chapters to education, because he believes a society cannot be just unless its people are rightly formed. He sees one thing clearly: you cannot build a just city out of unawakened souls. A city, like a person, becomes just only when reason knowledge leads action. But knowledge does not arise by itself. It must be nurtured, trained, illuminated. Hence, Plato places education at the center of politics. Education is not merely literacy. It is the training of the soul to turn toward the good. Education is the turning of the soul toward the light. Republic 518. Thus, Plato rejects the view of the pupil as an empty vessel to be filled. For him, knowledge is not poured in from outside. It is the awakening of what already lies within the soul. He calls this process anamnesis, recollection. According to Plato, the human soul once knew truth in the ideal realm, the realm of the forms, but forgets upon embodiment. Education, therefore, helps the soul remember what it already knows, not cram it with information. Learning is the recollection of eternal truths. Meno 81. So the teacher's role, like Socrates, is not to transmit, but to midwife discovery. Socrates does not say, "Here is the truth," but asks, "What do you think the truth is?" The question compels the student to light his own lamp. Plato believes that true education does not fill a vessel. It lights a flame. And once lit, that flame sustains itself because knowledge is the soul's native hunger. Plato does not regard education as a tool for livelihood, but as a journey toward the form of the good. In the Republic, he images education through the cave. The learner is the bound prisoner who sees only shadows. Education is the painful turning around eyes aching in the new brightness, until truth comes into view. The entire soul must be turned around from the world of becoming until it can endure the contemplation of the world of being. 518C to D. Crucially, education does not only teach what is right, it teaches how to see. It does not merely transfer content, it aims the soul. When reason faces the good, every act, politics, art, labor, naturally tends toward justice. Plato designs curricula for each order of the city because each serves a distinct function in the city's soul. Producers, a practical moral education. Aim honesty, self-control, responsibility. They do not need abstract metaphysics so much as training to live uprightly, keep their word, and serve the common good, the education of work and duty. The producers must do their own work and not meddle in the affairs of others. 433. Éducation A. Guardians education in temperance and courage. The warrior class safeguards justice and order. They must learn music to soften the soul and gymnastics to strengthen the body, a balance of logos reason and thymos spirit. Without knowledge, strength decays into violence. They must be gentle to their own people and harsh to their enemies. Republic. 375. Psychowadisi. Philosophers, pure intellectual and spiritual training. They study the longest roughly 50 years of formation through geometry, arithmetic, astronomy, dialectic, and finally, philosophy. Not to become cleverer than others, but so the soul grows accustomed to the universe's order, a model for a just soul. At the summit, they study the form of the good, the sun by which all other knowledge is seen. The study of the good is the highest knowledge. Once seen, it is the cause of all that is right and fair. 505A to B. Plato calls this comprehensive formation paideia, the integrated training of mind, heart, and body, music nourishment for the soul. Not mere art, but food for character. Proper rhythm and harmony temper the soul. Chaotic music erodes discipline and invites appetite. Musical training is a more potent instrument than any other, because rhythm and harmony find their way into the secret places of the soul. 401D. Gymnastics discipline for the body. Intellect will not thrive in a feeble frame. Gymnastics breeds courage, endurance, steadiness. But training the body without the soul breeds brutality, not bravery. Mathematics and philosophy, the ascent to light. Mathematics teaches the soul to see the unchanging within change the cosmos's order, and prepares it to behold pure truth, the language of the good. Education as purification. Not only for the young. Education does not end with youth. An entire life is a purification. In youth, purify desire. In midlife, purify ambition. In maturity, purify intellectual pride. Education is not what the sophists declare it to be, putting knowledge into the soul which was not there before, but turning the soul's eye to what is already there. 518C. Education for Plato is not a utility, but a right of the soul. Like a climber approaching the sun, every step is a higher awareness, every learning a small rebirth. Thus, for Plato, politics and education are one. There are no good rulers in a bad education, and no just citizens without an understanding of the good. The direction in which education starts a man will determine his future life. 425 A.T. A good polity is not the one with the most laws, but the one where few laws are needed because citizens themselves know and love the good. That is the highest justice personal virtue becoming public order. The object of education is to teach us to love what is beautiful. Law 653. A. Education then is not merely for work, but for learning to live rightly, beautifully, soulfully. Today we speak of credentials, productivity skills. Plato would ask, do learners know what they are aiming at? If education only makes us run faster without teaching us where to go, it is just more fuel for a car without a steering wheel. Real education teaches us to be human, to kindle reason, compassion, and a love of beauty. Only when that light is lit in each person can a society be truly just and free. If tonight you reflect on your own path, what you've learned, what you believe, what you don't yet understand, remember knowledge is not in the books, but in the light you choose to turn your soul toward. As Plato says, education does not create the sun, it merely turns our eyes toward it. More than 2,000 years later, Plato's question remains. Who should rule today? Power lies with the many. We call it democracy. One person, one vote. An opinion can spread in an instant. In that freedom, Plato might ask, do we choose those who speak well or those who understand well? In the age of social media, the crowd is no longer in the Athenian agora, but in endless comment streams. Sometimes truth is muted while the pleasant lie is praised. Plato warned in the Republic, democracy, without knowledge, becomes the tyranny of emotion. He does not oppose democracy. He reminds us freedom without wisdom is only chaos. In our technological era, AI can calculate, but only humans can discern justice. Perhaps Plato's philosopher king is no longer a single ruler, but a society in which each citizen thinks like a philosopher. Knowledge is the social compass, yet amid today's flood of information, that compass spins. We speak of data networks, crowds, but rarely of wisdom and the ethics of knowledge. Plato's question sounds into the night. Does society still believe in the leadership of wisdom? Maybe the philosopher king no longer sits on a throne. He or she is anyone who lights their own mind, asks questions, before judging seeks the good instead of victory. A just city needs not many rulers, but many awakened people. At dawn in Athens, sunlight touches the white columns of the Acropolis where Plato once walked. He looks upon a city of democracy, debate, and tragedy, and smiles. Justice is not in law, but in a soul that loves the truth. His dream was never a perfect society, but a society that keeps perfecting itself. If you are hearing this tonight, you too live in a city of lights, disputes, and injustices. Yet somewhere, a small torch is glowing within you. That torch is the philosopher in your soul. The part that still believes justice can be real, that people can learn to understand one another, that knowledge is not to outshine others, but to light the common road. Plato calls that light the good. And when you close your eyes, let it keep burning, not only in dreams, but tomorrow, when you rise and step into the world as a citizen of the ideal city. ChatGPT said, for Plato, the soul psyche is not mere breath or feeling. It is the self-moving source of energy that makes living things live and continue to be. In Phaedrus 245c to 246a, he writes, everything moved by another may come to a stop. But what moves itself never stops, for self-motion is the very essence of life. That which moves itself is soul. That is, the soul is the first cause of all life. It is not made by matter, does not depend on the body. It is eternal, self-moving, and immortal. If the body is the chariot, the soul is the charioteer. If matter is the melody, the soul is the musician who plays it. The soul cannot be killed because it is not born from death. When the body dissolves, the soul does not end. It returns to where it once belonged, the world of forms. Plato holds that before birth, the human soul lived among the gods and beheld the absolute beautiful, the absolute good, and absolute justice. In the ideal realm, a place without time or change where only pure truth is. But when the soul falls into this world entering a human body, it loses its wings, is veiled, and forgets the light. When the soul loses its wings, it falls to earth and takes a physical body. Phaedrus, 246Z. From then on, human life becomes a journey of recollection. Every time we encounter beauty, a smile, a melody, a sunset, the soul trembles with remembrance of the place to which it once belonged. When a man sees beauty in this world, he is reminded of true beauty, and his wings begin to grow again. Phaedrus, 249. That's it bees. For Plato, the soul's trembling before beauty is not mere passion, but sacred memory, the moment in which the soul recognizes itself. He describes the soul as winged, and the wings symbolize its desire to rise toward truth. The natural function of the wing is to lift what is heavy up to the region where the gods dwell. Phaedrus, 246, D. Whenever the soul beholds true beauty, it feels a sweet wound, longing, fear, rapture. Plato calls this mania divine madness, not pathological frenzy, but the God-touched ecstasy of love. This madness makes the soul wish to grow its wings back, to cast off the heaviness of matter and return to the realm of light. Beholding beauty, the soul grows wings and longs to fly away. Phaedrus, 249, Dafadid. Thus the wings are the emblem of awakening. When the soul forgets its origin, it loses its wings, heavy bound in matter. When it remembers the beautiful, its wings return, it grows light and rises. In the same dialogue, Plato gives the famous image of the soul's chariot, the charioteer reason logos, the white horse spirit, thymos, noble, honor-loving, oriented to the good, the black horse appetite, epithymia, weighty, pulled by bodily desire. Whether the soul ascends or falls depends on the charioteer. If reason governs both horses, the chariot rises to the realm of the beautiful and the good. If reason is weak and the black horse pulls askew, the chariot falls, and the soul is bound again to mortal body. This is not only a moral image, it is a psychological one. The conflict of reason will slash spirit and instinct within each of us. To drive the chariot to cultivate the soul is the chief task of philosophy and education, for only then does a person become truly free. Love eros in Plato is not bodily craving. It is the soul's attraction to eternal beauty. Diotima, the wise woman in Symposium, calls eros the child of poverty and plenty. Eros always longs because it is not yet perfect. Yet it is full of energy because it strains toward perfection. Love is therefore the movement of the soul upward. It may begin with physical allure, then transcend form to the beauty of character, and finally to the beauty of truth itself. He who climbs this ladder will come to behold a beauty that is eternal and divine. Symposium, 211, E. At the summit, the soul no longer needs an object to love, because it has become love. To understand Plato, one must grasp this. The world we inhabit is only a copy, a dim mirror of a higher reality. Everything around us, the rose, the music, the beloved face, is but the shadow of perfect forms that exist elsewhere in the intelligible realm. There is no time and no decay. Each universal beauty, justice, the good, exists pure, unalloyed, and unchanging. As souls we once saw them and knew what true beauty is. But when we fell into bodies, we forgot that light. Plato says knowledge is the soul's memory of what it knew before it was born. Thus, whenever we are moved by something beautiful, a piece of music, a glance, an evening sky, the soul is remembering what it forgot. Beauty in this world is a doorway to absolute beauty, a reflected ray of a distant sun. Only souls that learn to see through appearances will find the path back to the true source of light. Plato calls this philosophical eros a love that makes the soul rise, not possess. When the soul perceives beauty in another person in the eyes, the voice, the gait, the heart, it thrills not because of flesh, but because memory is awakened. In that instant, the soul's wings quiver, as if about to grow again after ages of forgetfulness. Plato says, beauty alone causes the soul's wings to grow. The true lover, therefore, does not seek to possess, but to ascend together, so that both souls may fix their gaze on one thing, only beauty itself. At that point, love becomes the religion of the soul. In the Symposium, Diotima tells that when the goddess Aphrodite was born, the gods held a feast. At that feast, Poverty-Penia slipped in to partake, and she saw Plentiporos, the god of resourcefulness symbol of wit and talent, lying asleep in Zeus's garden. Penia drew near, joined with Poros, and Eros was born. Love was begotten of plenty and poverty. Therefore he is always poor and far from being tender and beautiful as most suppose. He is hard, squalid, barefoot, homeless. Symposium 200, 3b to d. Eros is not perfect, not omnipotent. He is at once lacking and endowed, mortal and divine, painful and blissful. Eros is not a god, but a daemon, a being that stands between humans and the gods, between longing and wisdom, body and soul. Eros desires what he does not have, yet he knows what he desires. That is the difference between mere instinct and love. Love is not the possession of the good, but the desire that the good be one's own forever. Symposium 206 AI. Love, therefore, is a movement toward the good and the beautiful, not the urge to possess, but the effort to rise toward what is better, to become more complete in soul, in knowledge, in character. Plato uses the Greek daimonion to name Eros, a mediating spirit, with a twofold nature, mortal and divine. From the human side, Eros is lack, ache, emptiness. From the divine side, Eros is light guidance, the hunger for knowledge. Eros travels between two worlds, bearing the gods' messages to humans and humans' prayers to the gods. He interprets between gods and men, conveying and taking to the gods the prayers and sacrifices of men, and to men the commands of the gods. Symposium 200, 2e. In other words, Eros is the soul's language, the link that binds the finite human to the infinite. In Plato's vision, love is not merely a feeling, it is a metaphysical power, a doorway through which the mortal soul touches its own divinity. This yields one of Plato's most subtle and profound portraits. According to Diotima, the true lover ascends rung by rung on love's ladder from transient beauty to the eternal. He who would climb the heavenly ladder must begin from the love of one fair form, and ascend thence to the love of all fair forms, then to fair practices, to fair notions, until at last he perceives a beauty which is divine and unchanging. Symposium 2, 11c to d, rung 1, love of a single beautiful body. The beginning. The soul is drawn by bodily beauty. Eyes smile form. Plato does not deny the body. He treats it as the first doorway where the soul begins to remember true beauty. Rung 2, love of all beautiful bodies. The lover loosens attachment to a single form and recognizes beauty as universal, appearing in many shapes. Love begins to transcend possession. Rung 3, love of the soul and of mind. The lover turns toward virtue, understanding, and kindness, beauty as it lives within a person. Rung 4, love of knowledge and clarity. Love becomes the desire to know, to discover beauty in science, art, and the order of the cosmos. Eros here is creative energy, the fire that drives invention and philosophy. Rung 5, love of beauty itself, the summit. The lover no longer needs any particular beautiful object, for the soul beholds pure, eternal, unchanging beauty, the form of beauty, where love becomes a union of the lover with truth. He will see beauty, eternal, unbegotten, and imperishable, not growing and not decaying, not beautiful in one way and ugly in another. Symposium 211, A to B. At this height, love is illumination and the soul is reborn. Eros does not lead only to contemplation, it leads to creation. Diotima says, all men are pregnant in body and in soul. And when they come to a beautiful thing, they bring forth. Symposium 206C. Every soul is pregnant, and the beautiful acts as midwife, helping bring forth what is new, ideas, art, virtue, knowledge. To love is not only to want to possess. It is to beget the beautiful, a child, a poem, a noble deed. Thus for Plato, love is the wellspring of all human creativity. Without Eros, there is no art, no philosophy, for philosophy itself is a kind of love, philosophia, the love of wisdom. Love in Plato carries an immortal longing. We love in order to surpass finitude. The lover of the body seeks offspring. The lover of the spirit seeks legacy, knowledge, and ideas. The lover of truth seeks union with the eternal. Through love, man seeks immortality. Symposium 207, 8. Eros is the soul's instinct toward immortality, the power that makes us wish to live, to understand, to create, to leave a mark beyond time. A beautiful feature of the symposium is this: the one who teaches Socrates about love is not a male philosopher, but Diotima, a woman. Plato seems to say that knowledge arises not only from reason, but from sensitivity, intuition, and compassion. Diotima teaches Socrates that love is not the hunt for an object to possess. It is the search for a state of completion. He who loves truly will be in contact not with an image, but with the very essence of beauty. Symposium 212. Diactim toriens. Thus in Plato, love is the sacred ritual of the soul. To love rightly is to love upward, from body to soul, from another person to the cosmos, and finally back to oneself. He who ascends this ladder will suddenly behold a beauty, eternal, which neither comes nor goes, neither blossoms nor fades. Symposium 211. Seen through modern psychology, Plato's Eros is the creative energy within us. Carl Jung called Eros the principle of connection, the force that integrates what is scattered in the psyche. For Freud, Eros is the life drive opposed to Thanatos, the death drive. For Plato, Eros not only sustains life, it directs it. When we love, we do not only turn outward, we awaken inward strength. Every artist, poet, and philosopher is born of Eros, for the desire to touch beauty is what makes us create, search, and transcend ourselves. Plato writes in the Symposium, Eros is the longing born in the soul that makes us desire to beget the beautiful in body or in spirit. A child, a poem, a painting, an idea, these are all the children of Eros. When love is reduced to appetite, Eros is diminished. When love is raised to contemplation, Eros becomes the light that guides the soul back to heaven. Beauty is then no longer something to own, but something that reminds us where we came from. At the end of Phaedrus, Socrates says that the soul once followed the gods, beheld true beauty, and upon returning to the world can never forget that light. Hence all our human journeys to learn to love, to create, to think, are simply the effort to remember a lost paradise. Plato holds that humans were not born to live in shadow, but to return to the light that is theirs. Every soul, whatever its form, however many its errors, carries wings under the dust. And when we love rightly, when we contemplate beauty without craving to possess it, when we are moved for no other reason than the beautiful itself, those wings quiver again. Plato says, when strong enough, those wings will bear the soul back to where it once belonged, where the beautiful and the good are one. Tonight, as you close your eyes, think that every true stirring in your heart is the soul's memory of that realm where there is no pain, no fear, only light. Plato once wrote, "No man should think that the soul can be destroyed, for it is the beginning of all things." Phaedrus 245, 8ent. In his philosophy, the soul never dies, it only forgets the light. Every good act, every tremor before beauty is one more step on the way to remembering. When you love and your heart remains pure, when you forgive though wounded, when you choose truth over deceit, the soul's wings are growing back. And one day, when they are strong, the soul will pass through the mist of this world and return to the beautiful, the good, and the true, the place to which it has always belonged. Plato's influence on Christianity, Descartes, and Nietzsche can be read as a through line stretching over 2 millennia, from the Christianization of Platonism in late antiquity and the Middle Ages, through a re-rationalization in the 17th century, to Nietzsche's transvaluation of values at the end of the 19th. For Christianity, the key is the reception of Platonism/Neoplatonism, the idea of a pure reality beyond the sensible world, the immortality of the soul, the good as the supreme principle, and evil as privation, a lack of good, rather than a substance in its own right. The greatest early Western theologian, Augustine, read the books of the Platonists, as he notes in the Confessions, and from them his theology took shape: an invisible, non-material God, an ascending soul, evil as the absence of good, without its own being all characteristic motifs of Neoplatonism after Plotinus/Porphyry that seeped into early Christian teaching. Contemporary scholarship regards Neoplatonism as the most persistent philosophical influence on Augustine. More broadly, there is ample evidence of an increasingly Neoplatonized Christianity from Origen, possibly a student of Ammonius Saccas through the Cappadocian Fathers, to Augustine himself, familiar with Plotinus and Porphyry. Within the medieval and Renaissance Christian Platonist tradition, the forms were often interpreted as God's creative ideas. By this route, Platonism became a philosophical instrument for reading scripture, defending doctrine, and nourishing Christian aesthetics. Marsilio Ficino translated Plato and Plotinus in full sketching a Platonic theology of the soul's immortality. Later in England, the Cambridge Platonists continued to breathe a moral, rational spirit into faith. That lineage both Christianized and softened the hard edges of pure Platonism. Divine ideas were folded into the biblical logos. The hierarchy of being was religiously recast as angelology. The Platonic anagoge, the ascent upward, became the contemplative life. It is therefore precise to say Christianity did not simply copy Plato. It selectively absorbed and reinterpreted him in light of its own revelation. Even the Britannica underscores that each great Christian Platonist applies Plato in a distinct way, Augustine, to the point of generating a distinctive Augustinianism. With Descartes, Plato's influence appears in the guise of modern rationalism, instead of a purely metaphysical world of ideas, Descartes reconstructs epistemic foundations via innate ideas, clarity and distinctness, and a non-deceiving God who guarantees truth. The commitment to innate ideas situates Descartes within a rationalist line running back to Plato. Knowledge of the nature of reality derives from a priori structures of reason, not from the senses. In his correspondence and the Meditations, he repeatedly affirms at least 3 innate ideas of God, of finite mind, and of extended body, sometimes adding the mind-body union as a primordial notion. These ideas serve as templates by which we grasp all else. The system recalls Plato on 2 levels. 1, true knowledge does not rest on sense experience, an upward orientation of reason, and 2, the necessary and eternal structure of mathematics/logic provides the paradigm of reality. Yet there is a decisive difference. Instead of the good itself as guarantor, Descartes' God implants eternal truths in our intellect and guarantees the veracity of every clear and distinct perception. Whenever I grasp a proposition with absolute lucidity, God good and non-deceptive assures its truth. Here Plato's spirit is modernized as method absolutizing reason's lucidity, charting a path from idea to existence, notably in the proofs of God in the Meditations, and grounding scientific necessity through a mathematical physical model. If Plato provides a heaven of ideas, Descartes builds a halo of method around it. Instead of contemplating the form of the good, we act within an order of assurance in which rightness is secured by the divine design of human reason. With Nietzsche, that axis is broken. He sees in both Plato and Christianity a reversal of truth, the construction of 2 worlds, an immutable true world versus a mutable sensible one that impoverishes instinct, alienates life, and negates viewpoint plurality conditions of life itself. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche attacks Plato's invention of pure spirit and the good in itself, and writes the famous line, "As for the people, the struggle against Plato is the struggle against a millennial church oppression. For Christianity is Platonism for the masses." Here he yokes Platonism and Christianity as 2 variants of the same anti-natural morality, positing a beyond to condemn the here and now. The critique reaches its dramatic apex in how the true world finally became a fable in Twilight of the Idols. Through 6 stages, Nietzsche shatters the illusion of a true world beyond phenomena. Once the true world is abolished, the apparent world collapses with it, leaving life as it is without any tribunal from a transcendent realm. In this view, both Plato and Christianity are metaphysical techniques for devaluing life, idealizing weakness, and fostering a nihilistic psychology. Yet the irony is striking precisely by struggling against Plato/Christianity Europe, according to Nietzsche, accumulated an unprecedented tension of the soul from which it can fire toward the most distant goals. That rupture prompts his proposal for a first philosophy of affirmation. Rather than renouncing the earth in search of heaven/forms, say yes to becoming to the body, to the senses, to chance. Instead of the form of the good, live in the noonday brightness of the will to power and eternal recurrence, ethical aesthetic images stripped of metaphysics. This is the spear he drives into the entire traditional European morality rooted in Plato-Christianity. Set side by side, the 3 portraits yield a long dialectic of Western thought surrounding the Plato question. Christianity integrates Plato to construct a theology of the soul's ascent. Descartes secularizes Plato into a rationalist method guaranteed by God for innate truths. Nietzsche destroys Plato/Christianity's 2 worlds to restore value to finite life. However opposed they are, all 3 define themselves before Plato, sacralizing Plato, scientizing Plato, and then anti-Plato, making a metaphysics of dismantling metaphysics. Plato's lasting impact thus lies not only in his system, but in the force field he established for successors to lean upon or rebel against. To borrow a metaphor, Plato built the sky. Christianity painted on it the face of God. Descartes surveyed it with geometry, and Nietzsche smashed it so that the noonlight could pour straight down to earth. And from those collisions, modern philosophy learned 3 lessons. Values are never neutral. Every metaphysics exacts an ethical psychological price. Knowledge is orientation of existence, not mere correct seeing, whether oriented upward to eternity or back to earthliness. Great thought endures because it provokes unending debate between light from above and noon-light humanity continually negotiates its place in the cosmos. If Augustine found in Plato a language for the invisible God and the immortal soul, if Descartes found in Plato a rational stance to underwrite science, then Nietzsche, calling Christianity Platonism for the masses, reminds us that every transcendent telos risks devaluing life. And philosophy in the end is the art of choosing one's light, the imagined crystalline sky of pure reason, or the scorching sun of ordinary life. Plato's thought entered the history of the West not like a banner raised forever, but like a point of tension on a stretched rope, where reason is pulled toward 2 opposing directions, one drawn upward toward an ideal world, the other pulled forcefully downward toward experience, measurement, and doubt. That fracture did not destroy Plato. It is what allowed him to remain alive. From the very moment Plato closed his life, his greatest question ceased to belong to him alone. It detached itself from his name, from the academy, from Athens, and began to live a far longer life within the history of human thought. It became the central question of Western civilization, whether there exists a truth independent of what human beings see, touch, and feel. A truth not governed by political power, not bound to the traditions of a particular age, not altered by emotion or interest. And if such a truth truly exists, by what path can human beings reach it? Through reason, through the soul, through intuition? Or is it ultimately only an image constructed to help humanity endure a world that is fundamentally imperfect, chaotic, and unjust? That question was never answered, but it was precisely its lack of resolution that created movement. The first fracture in Plato's legacy did not come from his external critics, but from the very center of his intellectual inheritance, from the student he trusted most. Aristotle did not betray Plato in the ordinary sense. He did not reject his teacher by denying the value of reason or the search for essence. On the contrary, Aristotle preserved almost all the intellectual tools Plato had given him: logic, concepts, analysis, and the desire to understand the world as an ordered whole. Yet at the decisive point, he turned in another direction. If Plato often lifted his gaze upward, believing that the world we inhabit is only a dim reflection of a higher order, Aristotle bent down and remained with this world. If Plato believed that the essence of things, what makes something what it is, resides in ideal forms existing beyond space and time, Aristotle believed that essence lies within the thing itself, in its structure, function, and internal purpose. For Aristotle, one need not leave the sensory world to find truth. Truth is found in the way the world operates before us, provided we observe carefully enough and think rigorously enough. This difference may appear subtle, but its consequences are profound. Plato asks, "What does this world reflect?" Aristotle asks, "How does this world work?" Plato seeks a metaphysical anchor, a place where truth is not corrupted by change. Aristotle seeks an experiential foundation where knowledge is built upward from the particular toward the universal. These two paths do not directly negate one another, but they also cannot merge because they begin from two fundamentally different intuitions about reality. From that fracture, the history of Western thought gradually takes shape as a continuous oscillation between two ways of living. One believes that this world is insufficient, that there must be a higher order by which right and wrong, good and evil, true and false can be measured. The other believes that this world, though imperfect, is the only ground upon which knowledge can take root, and that any concept reaching beyond it must be treated with suspicion. Plato and Aristotle, in this sense, are not merely two philosophers. They become the two poles of an intellectual field from which humanity has never fully escaped. What is striking is that Plato seems to have foreseen this division. In his own dialogues, he rarely offers final conclusions. He writes in dialogue form not because he lacks certainty, but because he understands that truth, if it exists, cannot be confined within a single proposition. Aristotle, by contrast, seeks classification, systematization, and clarity. One leaves questions open, the other attempts to close them. From this point forward, Plato is no longer merely a figure in history. He becomes the symbol of a desire that never fades, the desire to believe that there is a deeper order beneath appearances, that reason exists not only to describe the world, but to rise above it. Aristotle becomes the symbol of another equally powerful impulse, the desire to stand firmly on the ground, to believe that this world, with all its complexity and contradiction, is the only place where human beings can understand and act. Both paths originate in Plato, and for that very reason, Plato never truly ends. He continues to exist each time human beings ask whether what they see is the whole of reality, or merely a surface concealing something deeper, more elusive, yet harder to abandon. From that moment onward, Western thought divides into two parallel streams. One carries Plato forward, believing that the visible world is only a faint manifestation of a deeper, invisible, yet more real order. The other follows Aristotle, believing that knowledge must begin with what can be observed, classified, and tested. When modern science emerges, it chooses Aristotle as its progenitor. It chooses experiment over contemplation, measurement over recollection of the soul. Plato is pushed back into philosophy, religion, and art labeled idealistic, dreamlike, detached from reality. And yet that exclusion is never complete. For science itself, despite claiming observation as its foundation, cannot function without the very structures Plato trusted most deeply. Physical laws cannot be seen. Mathematical models do not exist in nature as objects, yet they govern nature entirely. No one has ever seen gravity, yet the universe behaves as though it were a universal truth. Plato's name fades from speech, but his spirit remains present in the very way science understands the world. The conviction that behind surface chaos, there must be a deeper order. Plato disappears from language, but never from thought. When the early modern period arrives and belief in an absolute truth, guaranteed by tradition and theology, begins to falter, Plato is once again drawn into the light. This time, however, he is not summoned back as a master to be restored. He appears as a shadow to be confronted, an origin to be questioned. Europe is undergoing transformation. Science rises, religion is doubted, and human beings begin to realize that the foundations they once believed eternal can collapse. In that context, the need to find a secure ground for knowledge becomes more urgent than ever. René Descartes enters the history of philosophy not as a storyteller, but as a cleaner of the ground. He doubts everything tradition, the senses, experience, even mathematics. Not because he despises the world, but because he fears building knowledge on unstable foundations. And in that radical effort, Descartes inadvertently resurrects a new Plato, not the Plato of eternal forms existing outside humanity, but the Plato of inward turning, the Plato of radical doubt. I think, therefore, I Am is not a scientific discovery about the world, but a profound philosophical gesture, a retreat from external reality, to locate the only remaining point of certainty. It is not a statement about the universe, but about consciousness. In that moment, the external world becomes suspect. It may be illusion, it may be dream, it may be deception. Only a solitary center of awareness remains, recognizing itself as an undeniable event. In this way, Descartes repeats Plato, but reverses the direction of vision. If Plato doubts the sensory world because he believes in a higher metaphysical order, Descartes doubts the sensory world because he cannot yet be certain of anything beyond the act of thinking itself. Plato's ideal world lies beyond the human being. Descartes' certain world lies within the human being. Yet in both cases, the material world ceases to be an absolute foundation. It becomes something that must be proven, confirmed, reintroduced only after surviving the test of reason. The consequences of this shift are profound. From here on, Western philosophy carries a new tension between subject and world. Human beings no longer stand securely within reality as a natural part of it, but face it as suspicious observers. Reality is no longer received naively. It must be guaranteed by method, by argument, by internal certainty. And in that separation, Plato appears again not as a guide to an ideal world, but as the one who planted the idea that what we see may not be what is truly real. Descartes does not turn away from science. On the contrary, his method of doubt opens the path for modern science where all assumptions must be tested. But at the same time, he leaves behind an anxious legacy, human beings isolated within their own consciousness, forced to rebuild a bridge back to the world they once inhabited naturally. If Plato was criticized for separating the soul from the body, Descartes, in another way, separates thought from the world, leaving a gap that later philosophy will endlessly attempt to fill. And it is precisely within that gap that Plato continues to echo. Not as a complete system, but as an unresolved question, whether it is possible to ground knowledge securely without paying the price of alienation from the living world. Through Descartes, Plato ceases to be the philosopher of eternal ideas and becomes the symbol of modern humanity's intellectual unease. The anxiety that what we see, touch, and live with every day may not be enough to be called truth. Yet that very tradition is attacked most fiercely in the 19th century. Friedrich Nietzsche does not merely oppose Plato. He sees Plato as the origin of a mistake lasting thousands of years. According to Nietzsche, placing an ideal world above this one is an act of life denial. Plato, in his view, planted the seeds of contempt for the body emotion and instinct, those forces that give human life its vitality. Truth for Nietzsche does not reside somewhere beyond. It is created by willpower and perspective. There are no eternal forms. There are only interpretations. The 20th century deepens that fracture. Psychoanalysis replaces Plato's soul with the unconscious space that is not ideal or pure, but filled with conflict, repression, and contradiction. Linguistics and philosophy of language claim that we do not access the essence of things, only signs. Postmodern thought proclaims the death of grand narratives, the death of universal truth. All systems become suspect. All foundations begin to tremble. It seems at last that Plato has failed completely. And yet it is precisely in this era of radical skepticism that Plato returns not as a victor, but as a question that cannot be extinguished. For when no truth is believed to transcend sensation, humanity faces a new problem if everything is interpretation. What prevents power from deciding what counts as true? If no standard rises above appearances, who distinguishes knowledge from manipulation, understanding from propaganda, Plato's cave in the modern world is no longer made of stone walls and firelight. It is a screen. It is an endless stream of personalized information. It is an algorithm that learns how to keep us in place by constantly confirming what we already believe. No one binds our hands and feet, but many forces make us unwilling to move. No one blinds us, but many systems shape what we are allowed to see. Within this new cave, Plato's lesson is no longer to believe in an ideal world somewhere beyond. It becomes a way of living to remain suspicious of what appears before us. To continually ask whether what we see is the whole of reality or merely a carefully arranged slice of it. Plato does not ask us to run toward the light. He asks us to question the darkness. Thus, Plato no longer provides answers. He becomes the guardian of an open question, a role far more enduring than that of a system builder. His question cannot be resolved once and for all, because any attempt to close it turns it into dogma. Yet it also cannot be ignored without consequence, because abandoning it entirely leaves human thought vulnerable to something worse than error complacency. Plato is wrong about many things wrong in believing that the absolute order of the world can be fully described wrong in underestimating the power of history language and political force to shape what people call truth. He believed too strongly that reason alone could rise above circumstance. But he was right about what matters most, that human beings cannot live by sensory impact. Alone cannot sustain meaning if reality is reduced to what is immediately seen, measured, consumed, and forgotten. Without some upward-reaching impulse, however fragile, however uncertain thought, collapses inward, circling endlessly around what is familiar, comfortable, and already confirmed. That upward impulse does not have to take the form Plato imagined. It does not require eternal forms floating beyond time. It does not require a perfectly ordered cosmos guaranteed by metaphysics. What it requires is refusal, the refusal to accept that appearances exhaust reality, the refusal to believe that power alone determines meaning, the refusal to equate repetition with understanding. Plato's enduring relevance lies precisely here, not in the answers he proposed, but in the direction of attention he demanded. In this sense, Plato does not belong to the past. The past is too settled, too complete, too easily narrated. Nor does he belong fully to the future, which promises solutions, progress, and closure. Plato stands at the boundary where reason strains upward while fearing that there may be nothing solid to grasp. He occupies the narrow space where doubt and aspiration coexist, where thinking continues, not because certainty has been achieved, but because it has not. He stands neither with religion nor with science, because he predates their separation. He does not rest comfortably within idealism, because he is too aware of illusion. He does not belong fully to materialism, because he knows that matter alone cannot account for meaning. Plato exists at the point of greatest tension in human thought, where the question of truth has never been fully answered, yet never stopped being asked. That tension is not a failure of philosophy. It is its condition of survival. Whenever a society believes it has finally resolved the nature of truth, whether through revelation ideology or data, Plato becomes dangerous again. He reminds us that clarity can be a form of blindness, that certainty can be a shadow projected by authority, that what appears obvious may only be familiar. His legacy is not comfort, but disturbance. Not harmony, but friction. Not a worldview, but a pressure placed upon every worldview that claims finality. Plato does not ask us to abandon the world. He asks us not to mistake it for the whole. He does not demand that we escape the cave forever. He asks whether we know when we are inside it, and perhaps that is why he endures, not because his metaphysics survived intact, but because the human condition that gave rise to his questions has not changed. We still live surrounded by images. We still confuse visibility with truth. We still fear uncertainty more than falsehood. And we still need again and again a voice that does not tell us what to think, but forces us to notice that we are thinking at all. Plato does not give us peace. He gives us vigilance. And as long as human beings continue to ask whether the world they inhabit is the same as the world they understand, Plato will remain where he has always stood, at the edge of light and shadow, refusing to let either one claim the final word. Plato does not give us comfort. He gives us the unease necessary to keep thinking, and perhaps for that very reason, after more than 2,000 years, he has never truly left our cave. Plato did not begin philosophy with the question of how to live longer, become wealthier, or feel happier in a comfortable sense. He began with a quieter question, a heavier one, but also a more honest one. How should a human being learn to face death? Not the death of others, not death as retold in tragedy, but one's own death, the ending that cannot be avoided, cannot be negotiated, and cannot be postponed indefinitely. In Plato's thinking, philosophy is not the art of living better in this world, in terms of comfort or success, but the art of preparing to leave it in the right way. To modern ears, this can sound gloomy, even pessimistic, as if it were a rejection of life itself. But for Plato, it was precisely the condition for living rightly uprightly and without enslavement. Only when human beings truly accept that everything visible is temporary, the body possession's reputation power, can they love truth without fear of loss, pursue the good without being pulled off course by short-term advantage, and face life without panic at the prospect of its end. Plato does not call for the rejection of the world. He calls for the loosening of attachment. Between living in the world and being bound by it, Plato sees a decisive distance. Philosophy exists precisely in that space. It does not make human beings retreat from life. It makes them no longer wholly governed by it. When the body is in pain, the philosopher still feels the pain, but does not allow it to define who they are. When loss occurs, the philosopher grieves, but does not collapse, because they have long been familiar with the thought that nothing visible is permanent. This idea is expressed most clearly and most movingly in the dialogue Phaedo, where Plato recounts the final hours of Socrates not as a tragedy, but as a completion. What is striking is not how Socrates dies, but how he lives immediately before death. There is no panic, no anger, no pleading, no sign of a man driven into a corner. Instead, there is a strange calm, almost quiet, as if Socrates were stepping into a familiar room, rather than leaving the world behind. Socrates speaks with his students not to comfort them with easy promises, but to continue asking questions, the same questions he had asked throughout his life. He reasons about the soul, about knowledge, about the distinction between the body, and what makes a human being truly who they are. But what matters is not whether these arguments persuade by modern standards of logic. What matters is the attitude. Socrates does not use philosophy to escape death, but to walk directly toward it without losing himself. In that moment, philosophy ceases to be discourse. It becomes lived practice. The way Socrates faces death is the final proof of his entire intellectual life. If philosophy were only words, it would collapse before fear. But if philosophy is a lifelong training of the soul, then death is no longer a negation, but a test. And Socrates in Plato's eyes passes that test not through heroic bravado, but through inner consistency. For Plato, this is neither resignation to fate nor blind faith in rewards after death. It is an achievement, the achievement of a life accustomed to separating what is essential from what is dependent. The achievement of a soul that has learned to stand without leaning on the body on sensation or on external guarantees. In such a case, death is no longer a shock. It is the next step in a process that began long before. Plato seems to suggest that people fear death not because death itself is terrifying, but because they have attached the entire meaning of their lives to things they cannot take with them. Those who have lived philosophically are different. They have practiced letting go in stages, letting go of the illusion of control, letting go of the desire to dominate, letting go of the belief that they are the center of all things. When the time comes to let go of the body, it is only the final release, not the first. Here Plato reverses a common human intuition. Instead of seeing death as what makes life meaningless, he sees awareness of death as what gives life its proper order. Knowing that one will depart forces a more difficult question. What is worth carrying within the soul? Not material things, not titles, but how one has lived, how one has treated truth, goodness, and other human beings. In Phaedo, there are no melodramatic tears, no scenes of despair. There is sadness, there is regret, but there is no rupture. This is not because Socrates does not love life, but because he does not fear losing it. For Plato, this is the clearest image of freedom. Not the freedom to do whatever one wishes, but the freedom from being bound by the fear of losing everything. Perhaps this is why Plato places philosophy so close to death. Not to make human beings obsessed with endings, but to prevent them from becoming obsessed with everything else. When death is placed at the center of reflection, all other things return to their proper scale. Fame shrinks. Ambition quiets. Truth becomes more precious because it is no longer obscured by temporary advantage. Philosophy for Plato does not teach us how to die. It teaches us how to live so that death no longer becomes the collapse of meaning. And in the silence of the final moment, Plato believes that a prepared soul will not panic because it is not stepping into something alien, but into something it has been learning to face its entire life. In Phaedo, Plato has Socrates say something that shocks many readers, that true philosophy is a practice for death. Not in the sense of self-destruction, but in the sense of separation. When philosophers think, they temporarily withdraw the soul from the rule of the body, from hunger, pain, desire, fear, and the turbulence of the senses. They do not deny the body, but they refuse to let it govern. Death, in this sense, is merely the completion of a process that has unfolded over a lifetime. Plato does not believe the body is evil, but it is a source of disturbance. Every sensation carries distortion. The eyes see but can be mistaken. The ears hear but can be deceived. Desire pulls the soul toward what is pleasant. Fear pushes it away from uncomfortable truths. Truth itself, if it exists, must be independent of all this. It cannot depend on sensation because sensation changes. It cannot depend on time because time corrodes everything. Thus, Plato believes that the philosopher is someone who has died in parts while still alive, not biologically, but in relation to dependence. Each time one refuses to chase blind desire, the soul becomes less bound. Each time one chooses truth over comfort, the the soul grows lighter. Each time one accepts loss in order to preserve what is right, the soul takes another step out of the cave of fear. Death within this framework is no longer an enemy. It becomes the final test, whether the soul has become accustomed to standing on its own without the body. Those who have never practiced philosophy fear death because they have bound their entire identity to what can be lost. Those who have lived philosophically are calmer because they have long practiced letting go. This does not mean Plato encourages withdrawal from the world. On the contrary, he demands strict discipline in life. Philosophers must live justly, moderately, and attentively. If the soul is dragged down by bad habits, it will not stand firm when the body collapses. Death, in Plato's view, does not erase character. It reveals it. Here Plato goes further than many moral traditions. He does not ask, "What have you done in your life?" but "What kind of person have you become?" The distinction is subtle but profound. An action may be good in one context and bad in another. But a well-formed soul will naturally incline toward what is right, even when no one is watching. Plato believes that the soul carries memory, not personal memory, but memory of a deeper order to which it once belonged. Learning for him is not the accumulation of new information, but recollection. And death, in its most hopeful vision, is the moment when the soul returns to what it once knew more clearly than anything on earth. This is not a guaranteed religious promise, but a conditional hope. Only souls accustomed to truth will not become lost when they leave the body. This is why Plato places such weight on philosophy in education. Not to train for careers, not to sharpen debate skills, but to form an ordered soul. Such a soul will not panic before death, because it has not placed the entire meaning of life in what will disappear. It knows there are things that cannot be taken away: justice, practiced, beauty, contemplated, truth, loved. For modern readers, this perspective can be unsettling. We live in a world where death is hidden, medicalized, silenced. We learn how to extend life, but rarely how to end it. Plato moves in the opposite direction. He brings death to the center of philosophy, not to darken life, but to clarify it. When death is forgotten, everything else becomes exaggerated. Fame becomes absolute. Success becomes the sole measure. Failure becomes catastrophe. But when death is faced directly, the proportions change. What once seemed vital becomes smaller. What was once overlooked, character integrity, inner coherence, becomes decisive. Plato does not teach us to wait for death as though life were merely a corridor leading to an exit. He teaches us to live in such a way that death gradually loses its absolute authority over us. In his view, fear is not something to be crushed or denied, but something to be clarified. Philosophy does not anesthetize the fear of death. It illuminates it. And once fear is brought into the light of understanding, it changes its nature. What was once a force that silently dictates choices begins to loosen its grip. Fear no longer commands action from the shadows. It becomes visible, measurable, and therefore resistible. Only at that point, Plato suggests, does something like genuine freedom emerge, not the freedom to do whatever one desires in the moment, but the deeper freedom of not being coerced by the terror of loss. This freedom is subtle. It does not announce itself with triumph or heroic gestures. It appears quietly in the ability to choose what is right, even when it costs something to speak truth, even when silence would be safer to let go, even when attachment promises comfort. A person who has learned to see fear clearly is no longer driven by the need to preserve every possession, every status, every role. Death still exists. Loss still hurts. But neither one rules absolutely. life regains its proportions and choice regains its dignity. It is at this point that Plato's thought begins to resonate unexpectedly with traditions he never encountered and could not have consciously anticipated. Buddhism, emerging centuries later in a different cultural world, speaks of letting go of the self, not as an act of nihilism, but as a release from clinging. The suffering caused by impermanence, it teaches, comes not from change itself, but from the insistence that things must remain. In this sense, Plato's insistence on loosening attachment to the body and to sensory pleasure echoes a similar intuition that liberation begins not with acquisition, but with release. Christian asceticism, developing in yet another historical context, speaks of the death of the old person. Here again, death is not merely biological. It is ethical and spiritual. The ego, shaped by pride, domination, and appetite, must die so that a different mode of being can emerge, one oriented toward humility, love, and transcendence. Plato's philosopher, practicing detachment from the tyranny of the senses and the seductions of power, stands surprisingly close to this idea, even though his language is philosophical rather than theological. Existentialism, coming much later and often in explicit opposition to metaphysical systems, approaches the same crossroads from the opposite direction. It denies any guaranteed meaning beyond the world, denies any pre-existing order to fall back on. And yet it insists that confronting death honestly without illusion is the very condition for living authentically. Here too, death is not postponed or romanticized. It is faced. And in that confrontation, life gains intensity, responsibility, and seriousness. Plato would not agree with the existentialist rejection of transcendent truth, but he would recognize the structure of the problem. A life that refuses to look at death cannot fully claim itself as a life chosen. Plato does not coincide entirely with any of these traditions. He does not dissolve the self as Buddhism ultimately seeks to do. He does not ground his thought in divine grace as Christianity does. He does not abandon the hope of objective truth as existentialism often does. And yet he stands at a deep crossroads where all these paths briefly intersect. At that crossroads lies a shared insight. The question of death cannot be separated from the question of how to live. To ask what happens at the end is already to ask what deserves our loyalty now. For Plato, philosophy exists precisely to hold us at that crossroads, to prevent us from fleeing into distraction, accumulation, or denial. It slows us down enough to ask whether the life we are building could withstand its own ending. Not whether it would be remembered, but whether it would remain coherent when stripped of everything accidental. When fear no longer governs every choice, when attachment no longer defines identity, something steadier becomes possible. A life shaped not by what it clings to, but by what it understands to be worthy. In this way, Plato's philosophy does not point us away from life, but deeper into it. It does not promise certainty about what lies beyond death. Instead, it offers something more demanding, the discipline of living, as though meaning must be earned through clarity, restraint, and love of truth. Death remains inevitable, but it no longer has the final word. The final word belongs to the life that has learned how to face it. Perhaps the most important legacy Plato leaves is not the theory of an immortal soul, but an attitude. An attitude that philosophy is not an intellectual game, not a tool for domination, not a means of winning arguments. It is a long, quiet discipline preparing for the moment when all illusions fall away. In that moment, whether we call it death, the end of a role, or the dissolution of an identity, what remains is the person as they have become. Plato believed that if the soul has learned to love what is right, beautiful and good while alive, it will not feel alienated when the light of the body fades. Philosophy, therefore, is not a path for escaping life. It is a way of living so that the ending does not become a collapse. And in the silence of the final moment, Plato hoped that a prepared soul would recognize something familiar, not as a new discovery, but as a final memory awakened. Plato did not only write about power, he tried to step into it, and it was precisely there that his philosophical dream collided with the hardest reality. A thinking mind can face human beings, once they hold power, do not behave like ideas. They behave like creatures stretched taut between ambition, fear, and desires that have never been trained. Plato believed that the Republic was not merely an intellectual exercise or a theoretical model meant for debate within the academy. For him, the image of the philosopher king was not a beautiful metaphor, but a real possibility, fragile yet genuine. Once a human being has seen the good, has escaped the cave of illusions, then it becomes dangerous for that person not to rule. For if power falls entirely into the hands of those who have never questioned themselves, then society, no matter how smoothly it functions, will gradually slide toward injustice. It was precisely this conviction that made Plato unable to content himself with writing alone. He felt compelled to try, and it was that compulsion that led him away from Athens, away from the relatively safe space of dialogue, and into a world where words were no longer enough to protect the speaker. Syracuse at the time Plato arrived was a wealthy, strategically important, and deeply unstable city-state. It was not a society seeking philosophy, but one struggling to preserve power. The Syracusan court operated on suspicion, on temporary alliances, on a constant fear of betrayal. Advice there was not weighed according to truth or falsehood, but according to how useful it was to those who ruled. In that environment, Plato appeared profoundly out of rhythm, without ambition, without intrigue, without personal gain in mind. Paradoxically, it was precisely this integrity that made him dangerous. Plato did not come to Syracuse with the intention of overthrowing the regime or imposing immediate reform. He was not a believer in rapid revolution. He believed in education. He believed that if the soul of the ruler were shaped correctly, if the ruler learned to distinguish between what is pleasant and what is good, between power and justice, then political order would change naturally. And so, he placed his hope in Dion, a man close to power, apparently receptive to philosophy and willing to listen. Through Dion, Plato believed he could reach Dionysius, the young tyrant of Syracuse, who had not yet been completely hardened by power. Dionysius, in Plato's eyes, was not evil by nature. He was a young, intelligent, ambitious man, raised in an environment where strength was equated with control. Plato saw an opportunity there. If education could come before complete corruption, if the soul could be guided before power distorted it beyond repair, then the model of the philosopher king might begin here. Not by turning Dionysius into a philosopher overnight, but by planting in him doubt about his own desire to dominate. But this was precisely where Plato underestimated reality. Power does not wait for slow education. It does not allow prolonged hesitation. A ruler who lives under constant threat of overthrow has no space for deep self-examination of the soul. Plato's questions about moderation, self-mastery, and who truly deserves to rule were not merely abstract. They directly threatened the psychological foundation of power, the belief that the one who rules naturally has the right to do so. Plato entered Syracuse as a teacher, but he quickly discovered that in politics, the teacher is easily seen as a destabilizing force. Education in the eyes of untrained power is not enlightenment, but dangerous doubt. A ruler may accept advice on strategy, economics, or warfare. but advice about self-limitation, about renouncing the pleasures of power, about admitting that one may not yet be fit to rule, this is far harder to tolerate. Gradually, Plato realized that he was not educating an empty soul waiting to be shaped, but confronting a soul already occupied by power. Dionysius could listen to Plato during conversations, but when he returned to the court to intrigue and fear, those lessons became alien, even threatening. Plato was not refuted by argument. He was neutralized by politics. His presence began to be seen as disruptive, as sowing instability, as forcing the ruler to question himself when what he needed was absolute certainty. Here Plato's dream began to fracture, not because his philosophy was logically wrong, but because he confronted a harsh reality. Philosophy requires time while power is impatient. Philosophy demands humility, while power feeds on self-assertion. Philosophy needs space for doubt. Power demands decisiveness, sometimes blind decisiveness. These two rhythms cannot easily merge when the soul has not been prepared in advance. Plato came to Syracuse believing that education could precede power. He left Syracuse having learned a painful lesson: when power comes first, education is easily bent or eliminated. And from this experience, the deepest scar of Plato's life was formed, not the scar of a philosopher rejected, but that of a human being who recognized the limits of the very ideal he most deeply believed in. Reality unfolded otherwise. Power does not wait for the soul to mature. It demands swift decisions, immediate punishment, and absolute loyalty. Lessons about moderation, justice, and personal renunciation may sound noble in a classroom, but they become dangerous in a palace. A ruler surrounded by flatterers does not easily accept being reminded that he may not yet be worthy to rule. In such an environment, the philosopher quickly becomes a threat. Plato was not refuted by reasoning, because in Syracuse, reasoning did not determine fate. He was pushed aside by politics, by silent gestures, backroom decisions, and the cold gaze of power when it feels endangered. His advice was not proven false. It was labeled inappropriate. Not because it lacked depth, but because it demanded a different tempo from the tempo of power. It required slowing down in a world that demanded decisiveness, self-examination, in an environment built on absolute affirmation. Plato's warnings about the corruption of the soul when it is not trained about power, left unchecked, turning itself into its own purpose, were seen as weakening authority, not because they immediately threatened social order, but because they threatened the psychological security of the ruler. A ruler can tolerate criticism from external enemies, but it is far harder to tolerate a voice that suggests one's power may not be morally justified. In such circumstances, philosophy does not need to be overthrown. It only needs to be made irrelevant, harmless, and eventually removed from the center of influence. And so Plato was pushed to the margins. Not by a public sentence, not by loud condemnation, but by the gradual withdrawal of opportunity access and voice. He was excluded from the center of power he had once hoped to reform from within. In a bitter and deeply symbolic episode, Plato was even nearly sold into slavery, a philosopher who had written about ideal order and supreme justice, standing on the brink of becoming someone else's property, priced like an object of exchange. That moment was painfully paradoxical. A man who believed the soul to be the highest good, who insisted that no human being should be reduced to a means, nearly lost his own personhood, to the very structures of power he had hoped to improve. This was not merely a personal humiliation. It was a brutal exposure of a truth Plato could no longer ignore. In a world not trained by philosophy, human beings can very quickly turn others into tools, regardless of the ideals they profess. This experience cannot be understood as a single historical accident. It was a direct collision between two irreconcilable logics, the logic of philosophy and the logic of raw power. Philosophy operates through questions, through suspended judgment, through the demand that one examine oneself before judging others. Raw power operates through commands, speed, and certainty, no matter how fragile that certainty may be. One requires space for doubt. The other treats doubt as a threat. In that collision, Plato realized something that many political thinkers after him would also be forced to admit: power does not hate philosophy because philosophy is wrong. Power hates philosophy because philosophy refuses to be silent. It does not accept what is obvious simply because it exists. It asks why one person rules and another obeys. It asks what power serves beyond itself. And such questions asked at the right moment, in the right place, can undermine the psychological foundations of power more deeply than any rebellion. Untrained power cannot endure questions. It needs affirmation, not reflection. It needs voices that reinforce its sense of legitimacy, not mirrors that reveal moral limits. In such an environment, the philosopher does not need to be destroyed. It is enough to portray him as impractical as a dreamer, as someone who does not understand how the world really works. And when philosophy is pushed into that corner, power can continue operating without disturbance, at least for a time. But the price of that silence, Plato gradually realized, is not peace, but the accumulation of error. For when no one is safe enough to ask questions, power begins to believe it is identical with truth. And that moment, whether it arrives slowly or suddenly, always carries the seeds of decline. After Syracuse, Plato no longer wrote about politics in the same tone. The Republic remained as an ideal, but his later works grew more cautious, more somber. Plato did not abandon the philosopher king, but he seems to have understood that the conditions for its realization are almost impossible to meet in the real human world. Not because philosophy is wrong, but because the human soul is too fragile when faced with unrestrained power. Here Plato did not fail as a thinker. He failed as a human being who believed that knowledge could precede the instinct to dominate. That failure allowed him to see something deeper, that politics is not merely a matter of laws or institutions, but a matter of the soul. A society cannot be more just than the degree of inner self-mastery possessed by those who rule it. This makes Plato unusual in the history of political thought. He did not believe that designing the right system was sufficient, nor did he believe that power automatically reveals true character. He believed that unless the soul is trained beforehand, power will amplify its worst defects. No mechanism can fully compensate for that absence. After Plato, many chose different paths. Machiavelli would accept power as it is separating ethics from politics. Hobbes would attempt to bind power through mutual fear. Modern thinkers would place their faith in institutions' laws and structural checks. Plato chose none of these paths. He went in the opposite direction. He sought to transform human beings before granting them power. And for that reason, he failed in practice, but left behind a question that has never lost its relevance. That question is this: can a society be better than the people who govern it? And if not, what should philosophy do? Remain outside power to preserve its integrity, or enter power at the risk of being distorted? Plato tried to enter, and he paid the price. Yet that failure did not make him bitter. It made him clearer. Plato did not become a pessimist. He became someone who understood that philosophy cannot command the world. It can only do something more modest, but more enduring. Remind the world that power is not truth, that victory is not proof of rightness, and that a society can function smoothly while being fundamentally wrong at its core. Seen this way, Plato is no longer the architect of an ideal state, but the earliest and most penetrating warning about the tragedy of untrained power. He understood that when philosophers enter politics, they may be destroyed. But when politics has no room for philosophy, society drifts toward a far more dangerous condition, one in which no one is free enough to question what is taken for granted. Perhaps that is why Plato withdrew to the academy. Not because he abandoned the world, but because he chose a different battlefield. If power could not be reformed from above, then the soul would have to be trained from below. Education for Plato became the longest form of politics. Quiet, without immediate victories, but more enduring than any coup. Plato understood that he might fail with a single ruler, but he must not fail with the next generation. And in that quiet persistence, philosophy continued to live, not in palaces, but in unanswered questions in human beings who learned to doubt themselves before doubting others. This part of Plato's life is often overlooked because it is not glorious. There is no victory, no successful model, only a great mind confronting its own limits. Yet it is precisely here that Plato becomes most human. No longer a dreamer drawing cities in the clouds, he becomes someone who stepped into the mud of power, fell, and emerged with a painful but honest lesson. Philosophy cannot save the world through power, but it can save human beings from confusing power with truth. And in that failure, Plato remained faithful to what mattered most. He never stopped asking questions, never stopped doubting what functioned smoothly, never stopped reminding us that a society can endure for a very long time while moving in the wrong direction if no one remains calm enough to ask, what are we living for and who is truly leading us? Part 7 does not close Plato as a story of success. It closes him as a warning that philosophers, when they enter power, may fail. But power, when left without philosophers, fails in a far more dangerous way, not within a single lifetime, but in the fate of entire civilizations. As I close this journey through the world of Plato, I realize that he was not merely an ancient philosopher. He was the architect of humanity's eternal longing, the longing for beauty, for goodness, and for absolute justice. Though thousands of years have passed, his question still echoes. How can the soul find the true light? Plato taught me that truth is not found out there. It resides within the soul that has learned to love, to doubt, and to rise beyond the shadows. He believed in the power of education reason and loved the lamps that guide humanity, from chaos to order, from sensation to understanding. If this story made you reflect, tell me in the comments which part of Plato's journey stayed with you the most. And don't forget to follow and tap the heart to continue traveling with me to those places where philosophy, history, and the human spirit meet in nights filled with light and storytelling.